My name is Nikki, and I head up the Institute for Creative Conversations in Benoni, between Benoni and Kempton Park. And it's really wonderful to be able to be starting the very first of our monthly conversations with somebody of meaning, somebody who brings meaning to the world and to our lives. And so I get to introduce two of my colleagues today, Nsamu and Trevor. But before we do, just a couple of admin parts, please. We are recording this for podcast purposes, as well as for people who would have liked to have been here but are not able to. So if anybody would not like to be seen, you're welcome to switch your video off, your stop video. We are going to, Nsamu is running a fairly tight ship in terms of some questions and thoughts that he has, and there will be time, we hope, for you to possibly ask a question or two, or perhaps just to give some feedback and some comments. And we're inviting you to do this in the chat box, please, which is at the bottom of your screen. So you're welcome to comment as we go along or ask questions, and we hope that we might be able to get to some of them. Then importantly, Natasha, just wave Natasha so that people can see you. There we go. Natasha is our techno fundi, and she's going to be highlighting Nsamu and Trevor for the bulk of this conversation. So if you would like to follow them only, you moved your mouse to the top of your screen, and there should be on the right-hand side almost like a little waffle pattern with a view sign. And if you click on that, it'll give you speaker view, gallery view, and full screen. So what we'd like to suggest is that you put it on speaker view so that you really are only seeing Trevor and Nsamu. Would that be okay? Okay, so it's a very big honor to welcome my co-creator, my mentor, my friend, Trevor Hudson, and a very big honor to welcome colleague and friend Nsamu as well, who will be conducting the interview this afternoon. And so with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Nsamu.
Hello, and welcome to Conversations of Meaning. I'm Nsamu, and with me today is Trevor Hudson. Trevor has been a part of the Methodist movement for over 40 years. Besides his religious commitments, he travels widely preaching and teaching. Trevor teaches at Fuller Seminary, the Ronneveer Institute, and the Jesuit Institute in South Africa. He's the co-founder of the Institute for Creative Conversations and is a well-known author of 22 books. He has been married to Debbie for 42 years, and together they are the parents of two children, Johnny and Mark. And in the foreword to your book, Trevor, Hope Beyond Tears, to which I would like to return later, Dallas will describe you as an open soul who can open other souls. An open soul who can open other souls. It's quite a rare way of describing, especially for a man describing another man. And that's a special way of describing you. And I can testify to that as somebody who has met you over the last number of years. So it's a great honor for me to have this conversation with you. And so, Trevor, that is what the biography says about you. I want us to begin just here. My biographical presentation of yourself is a story. It is perhaps a story that fits into my narrative. And the story could change when the context changes. And if I met you tomorrow and my situations were different, I might say something different altogether. So when we change the story, we change our reality. I want us to talk about how you came to narrative practice as a leader, a pastoral worker, and a therapist. How did you come to narrative therapy?
Thank you, Nsamu, and thank you for the welcome, and thank you to each of the participants in this moment. Really grateful for you joining us, and I hope that the conversation with Nsamu will also be meaningful for each of you. How did I come to narrative practice, narrative therapy, narrative ideas? About 20 years ago, I was exploring possibilities for further academic study for myself. I guess people often do that around the age of 50, and I was looking for a way of furthering my own academic journey. But more importantly, I was also looking for a way in which I could perhaps deepen my own life in my pastoral vocation. I was working as a Methodist minister, and being a pastor has always been a big thing for me, and I wanted just to deepen my own competency, perhaps, as a pastor. And my attention was drawn to a master's program which the Institute for Therapeutic Development was running in Pretoria, and they were doing that together with the University of South Africa, with UNISA. So you did your training with the Institute for Therapeutic Development, and the degree was given by UNISA. And so I applied, and they accepted me. And what drew me was, I think, the fact that it was a program that was rooted in narrative practice. And the word narrative, for me, suggested another word which has been very important for me over the years, and that's the word story. As a pastor, I always counted a real privilege to be able to listen to the story of another human being. And I think one of the privileges of being a pastor is one is given access by so many people into their lives. And when one walks into another person's life, one walks into a story which they share with you. So you know, for so many years, I had worked with people's stories. They were important. And on the other hand, I also was a person who loved to share a story, to share the story of God, particularly the story of God in the story of Jesus Christ. That story has meant everything to me. And so story was just a natural part of my world as a pastor. Someone once said that a pastor is someone who listens to stories, interprets stories, and is a bearer of a story. And so when this possibility to do narrative presented itself, and I knew nothing really about narrative theory or narrative practice, but I knew something about that word narrative. I knew it meant story, and it was that drew me in, and so I applied. And so I'll always be grateful, and I need to honor them. My first teachers in narrative, Elmarie Kotzer and Dirk Kotzer. And then it was while I was doing my master's that I also had a wonderful opportunity to spend 2 weeks with the founder of narrative practice and theory, Michael White, at Dulwich in Adelaide in Australia. And that was also a very significant time of learning for me. So that was my entry into the world of narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear why story is important for you in the way that you already narrating your own little entry into that. And how has it been for you? How has that journey been for you at this point?
You know, it's been a ongoing journey of learning, and it has been, narrative has been a way that has influenced very deeply the way I actually do ministry, and I'm not an active pastor anymore within a local congregation, but from that moment onwards, I found myself weaving narrative into my life. So it wasn't so much even a skill. It was, I was beginning to live a little bit more narratively. And certainly in terms of my work, narrative became so important, and I'm really happy to tease that out in a more specific way if you would like me to a little bit later. Yeah.
So maybe that's a good way to start actually leading into what about narrative practice? Anything in particular that stands out for you as significant?
Yeah, a number of things, and I need to limit myself because I could go on and on and on about this. I think first of all, the real emphasis on story, that when I meet someone, I meet someone who has a story to share and to tell. And it's a unique story, it's an unrepeatable story, and it is this person's story. And so I think my level of, when I'm with someone, my level of curiosity, and I don't mean that in an intrusive way, but a sense just of real, my sense of curiosity about a human being and the story of this human being became very, very important for me. And I think particularly, when we tell our story, we always pick up certain storylines in our story, and we often marginalize or let some other storylines remain unstoried. And I've always had an interest when someone tells a story. I'm also interested in the story that they haven't told, the story that they've maybe marginalized, the story that they've pushed away from themselves. So I think this whole world of story, that every encounter with every human being became for me a significant encounter because of this place of this emphasis in my own life of story. But then take that to another level. Each person who lives a story also lives in a bigger story. It's the story of my culture, it's the story of my history, it's the story of my extended family, it's the story of the society where I grew up. And that bigger story also is, it's also living in the story of the person. So when I'm with someone, I'm also aware that they're part of a bigger story, and that I really need to be aware of that, because I think it affects the way we relate to each other very, very deeply. And particularly here in South Africa, I'm very aware that if a man walks into a room and a woman walks into a room, or men walk into a room and a woman walks into a room, and older folk walk into a room and younger people walk into a room, and white people walk into a room and black people walk into a room, everyone experiences that room differently. Everyone experiences what is going on in that room in a different kind of way, because there is a sense in which we're all entering that room with a bigger story that is also very, very important. So I think the other thing that narrative did for me, if I may mention just one or two more things that have been very important, it really highlighted for me the importance of conversation. That a conversation is a profoundly transformative, it's a profoundly transformative thing, that if I genuinely enter into a conversation with another person, a lot goes on in that conversation, and I seldom leave a conversation the same person. That as I enter into another person's story through conversation, that story affects me, and it affects my story and the way I word my own story. So much happens in a conversation, and I think one of the great gifts of narrative is that it really that some of the narrative practices and skills really can empower us to have more life-giving conversations. I think that we live in a historical moment, in many countries, in a historical moment when people really battle to have significant conversations with each other, particularly when there is a great amount of difference. Conversations become very difficult for a number of reasons. And I think narrative has something to offer in terms of learning, and I'm still learning to have conversations of meaning with someone else. I think another maybe if I can say two more things that are just in my head at the moment. I think another very big theme of narrative is the theme of meaning. And we've called these conversations of meaning, and I think people are always seeking to make meaning of their lives, and there's a sense in which we are made for meaning. And I know that there's been a lot outside of the narrative world. I think of people like Viktor Frankl, for example, who built his whole understanding of therapy, logotherapy, built that on a foundation of a human being's need for meaningfulness, to make sense of their life. And narrative, I think, brings a lot of, it just brings a lot of insight and some helpful practices so that we can help each other make more meaning of our one precious life that we have on this earth. I think the last thing I want to say, and I think then I need to draw a line under this, narrative is very hopeful. And that narrative therapy in particular is a very hopeful therapy. It's a very hopeful practice. And I'm sure that many people listening in will know that, but one is constantly looking for hope in the conversation. But hope is not an abstract thing. We look for hope, as it were, the seeds of hope in the person's story themselves. So it's not that we're bringing from the outside, bringing hope into you know, the picture. There is a sense that very often, maybe always, tucked away in our own lives, there are little seeds of hope. And I think one of the lovely things I think about a good narrative conversation is we look sometimes for those seeds of hope. And just let me just tell a quick story. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they were just saying that they are feeling absolutely numb at the moment. They just feel numb. They've been feeling numb for a few weeks now for various reasons. And so he was talking about his numbness, and then he just said, you know, yesterday I was driving for an appointment, and I turned on the radio, and my music, some of my favorite music came on, and so I asked him. I said, "What happened to the numbness when the music was on?" And he thought about that for a moment, and he said, "You know, it's funny you should ask me that, because I don't think I was feeling numb when I listened to that music." And it was almost as if music was a seed of hope in his own story, in his something. It was just a throwaway line. And suddenly our conversation went in a different way. We started speaking about music and the kinds of music that he liked. And this person who was struggling with numbness, within a matter of a conversation, I just sensed a new energy and aliveness. And I didn't bring it. It was just tucked away in his story. And we started. So I like that about narrative. I think it's tucked away in all our stories.
Mm.
I got a bit excited. I got a bit excited there myself, and my own numbness began to disappear a bit.
I saw that, and I'm feeling the same. I'm feeling enlivened just listening to that story, because that's the story of many. It's the story of many, because, again, as you were talking earlier, talking about the way I choose to tell my story comes with the decisions that I'm making about what I'm highlighting and what I'm marginalizing.
Sure.
And
Sure.
and that which I'm marginalizing can just be as important as that which I'm choosing to highlight. It just reminds me. Yeah, I don't know who said this, but somebody quoted it to me once and said, one of the things in therapy or in conversations with other people, the person who is coming in there to be listened to may be telling you one story, and behind that story, what they're actually screaming for is, please listen to what I'm not saying.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, definitely. And my memory, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but my memory goes back now, as I sit with you, my memory goes back 40 years to where I was 30 years of age, and I was in a very tough space, and I went for counseling to see a psychiatrist, a wonderful man. And it started a long journey with him. His name was Cliff Allwood. And I never forget, at the end of the first session, I had spoken for 1.5 hours, and he asked me a question right at the end. He said, "Trevor, I'm really interested in what you haven't told me yet." And you know, with that wondering, he put his finger on storylines from my life when I was 6 years of age, 7 years of age, and 8 years of age, and I had never verbalized those storylines to anyone. And it was just that wondering of his that suddenly brought that. So thank you for that.
And that's the beauty about stories, isn't it? It's what we are hearing. At the same time, it's what we are not hearing. it's also, I want you to speak to another element of narrative practice within the context of story. There's the storyteller, and the storyteller can also be the listener to their own story. But then there's also an external listener in this context. Speak a little bit about the place of listening in stories and narrative.
Sure. Thank you. No, thank you for that. You know, it was interesting, and what I'm saying now is not a critique. In my own formation in pastoral therapy through a narrative lens, through my 2 years of training at UNISA, the place of listening was not accentuated and for me, it almost worked the other way around, that as I saw the importance of story, I then began to really realize that listening is absolutely critical, and that we listen at so many levels to another person. You know, as you have already said, we are listening to, what gets verbalized, and we are in some ways also listening to what has not been verbalized. And some things, as it were, are implicit in a person's experience when they describe it. And sometimes when a person describes an experience, I need to also be listened to what is maybe implicit in the story and maybe needs to be given more airtime, just given more volume. And that can, I think, be very, very helpful for the person who's telling their story.
Mm. And also that sometimes we just want to know that however I fashion my story, that my story is meaningful, whatever meaning I might be attaching to it. And what I'm sitting here with is wondering about what happens to people who tell the same story over and over and over again. It becomes almost like a loop, and it becomes difficult for them to step out of that narrative.
Right. Again, thank you for that question. And I don't think I'm going to. I think my response will be inadequate, but I just want to say two things very briefly. Have a real need to tell their story over and over and over again, and that as a person is telling their story over and over and over again, something is going on for them. So I respect the need for someone to tell their story again and again and again. So let me say that clearly. I think when I'm listening to a story that is being told again and again and again, I find that maybe it invites me to wonder about their story in a different way. So I might wonder about their story in a way that is different to the way I wondered about their story the last time I listened to it. I will seek to listen to it as I will look for the unfamiliar in the familiar. And I just keep that before me all the time. So when someone is telling me a familiar story, I'm listening now, what is unfamiliar for me? as they tell me the story that I've in fact heard maybe a couple of times before. And sometimes I can wonder aloud in such a way that there's a shift in the way they tell their story the next time. And it's in that shift that so often there may be a sense of restoring their lives that may be in fact more hopeful, more meaningful, and more life-giving for them.
And is it also possible that even though the person may be verbally telling the same story, that the story might be changing in emphasis? It might be changing in where they place the inflections. You know, maybe the tone of their voice might change with every telling of the story.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to. I'm happy. Somehow, I'm happy to hear that. As a person who tells, sometimes I have chosen certain narratives, and I run those narratives over and over. And there are times when I have felt a certain amount of self-judgment. And I've said that many times before. And I'm happy to hear that, because especially as we are going to speak in a little moment, especially in moments when people are grieving, there's not a tendency. Grief itself kind of is repetitive. Grief can be cyclical. And sometimes we live in a culture, in a society that almost wants people to step out or snap out of their grief almost prematurely, because I've heard that story many times before. So I would like to come back to that. With that connection, I want us to look at, you know, you are a co-founder of I4CC, the Institute for Creative Conversations. So the story I make up for that is that you have seen, and the reason for you to have decided to set up this institute is that you have seen not just the potential, but the value that narrative practice has within the context of the South African culture. I wanted to think how you see the connection between the values, ideas, and practices of narrative therapy and the South African context.
Yeah. I really hope that some of what I have said, I really hope that some of what I said will be seen within the South African context. And I want to maybe highlight one or two things that I've said just to underline them again, that we cannot separate ourselves from the larger story in which we've lived. And I think we really need to bring that awareness into our engagement with people from whom, where there is difference. I think it is essential for us to be aware that there's a larger story here. And in a larger story, there usually are, taken for granted ideas that we need to look at. There's usually certain ways of relating around power, and the kind of the power relationships that exist in South African society. And I need to be aware of those power relationships that do exist within our society, where certain voices maybe are accentuated and other voices are marginalized. And so I need to have this awareness all the time when I'm in a quote unquote South African conversation. There is a larger story going on here, and that larger story is present when two people are having a conversation. I think also maybe, you are aware of this, I'm aware of this. South Africa is also a highly, highly traumatized country, historically traumatized and traumatized well, through the pandemic, which has highlighted all the other pandemics, which are already part of South African life, around inequality, around gender-based violence, etc. And I think if I were to come into the present moment, the South African pandemic, or the pandemic in South Africa, has really highlighted and put onto our radar screen the other pandemics and the associated trauma and loss and grief that goes with living in this country. I think those levels of trauma and grief and loss are immeasurable. And anyone working narratively or just being with people, I think we need to really develop an awareness around those levels of trauma and grief and loss within South African society.
Yeah, and we cannot look away. I mean, somebody doesn't have to go very far from where they live to see the story as it unfolds. And here we're sitting with a story that is contained within social structures. At the same time, we're sitting with a story that is contained in historical contexts that sometimes can be overwhelming, even to begin to think about contending with them. I'm also, I'm curious about South Africans love story, and I'm thinking about, think about the braai culture, for example. The most important thing around the braai sometimes is not the roasting of the meat and whatever. It's usually the stories that accompany that. And when people gather around a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, or whatever, there'll be stories that accompany that. And sometimes stories can look so mundane and ordinary, but I like to think that there's no such a thing as an ordinary story. Any story where there's a gathering is a meaningful story, because beneath the words that are being uttered in the storytelling is the affect. It's how people feel when they're in the company of each other, when they're telling the story. I was just thinking about that as you were speaking. And I want to go back to this element of story again as a very historical practice, isn't it? I see it as a very historical practice. As a person who grew up with the privilege of having a grandmother myself and an older mother, one of the things I really cherished was sitting around the fire and listening to stories and participating in stories. And these stories, sometimes even when I'm sitting here, there are stories that sit in my subconscious and I'm not even thinking about them, but there are stories nonetheless that continue to inform how I make decisions and how I meet people. So there's that side to the stories as well, that these stories sit somewhere in my recesses, and they inform the decisions that I make. What would you say to something like that in the work that you have done, in the way that you have worked with people in different communities? How do people come to stories and the stories that you have made?
Thank you, Nsamu, just of underlining the kind of, story itself. Stories are based in time and place. Stories have a history. And so I think when I'm listening to a story, I'm listening also to a history of this particular person. I think what I also find so important is that when I listen to the story of a person, one person, through that story, I'm entering into and I've said this again, into a bigger story of that person's family, of that person's background, of where that person comes from. I think sometimes here in South Africa, we sometimes, and I think it's unhelpful. We sometimes want to quote unquote move on, and I think there is an important invitation for us to find new stories for us to live in. But I think in order to do that, we also need to honor and respect stories that have history to them. And that is personal stories of history, collective stories of history. And those stories are absolutely critical in order for us to find our way into perhaps the living of a new story in the future. So there's a sense in which stories are past, present, and future. And narrative encourages it encourages a very deep respect to the historical story of a person, as well as the possibilities of, to use a little bit of narrative language, the important possibilities of perhaps reauthoring or reimagining a new story for us, both personally and collectively.
In the context of stories, there are also medium. Stories come in certain packages. I'm curious, what do you think about the medium of stories? For example, music is a bearer of story. Paintings are bearers of stories. Theater is a bearer of stories. Yeah, just give me an idea of what song for you at the moment is a bearer of your present story, or song, or whatever piece.
Oh, this is quite embarrassing and quite. I just listen to people like Ed Sheeran and Sam Smith, and there's nothing necessarily kind of profound about. Well, I don't want. What I like about their music is it just invites me to dance, and. Our little story in our home is that when certain music comes on, Debbie and I leave. I'm married to a woman whose name is Debbie. Debbie and I leave whatever we are doing, and we begin to dance. And so music invites us to live a story of joy and delight. And just a little story, just before, if there's space here for me just to tell a little story of, I think in November, I'm sitting in a study here, and but I was in a room next door in a bedroom, and I got a phone call. And the phone call brought me very, very bad news, sad news. Let me rather put it like that. It was, and the person phoning me wanted me to bear that sad news to Debbie. And Debbie was sitting here in the study, so she didn't know I was on the phone. So after the sad, and it really was, I'm kind of smiling now, but it was a heartbreaking call in many ways. I came into the room to bring the sad news to Debbie. Debbie had just turned on the music in this room, and she was playing Ed Sheeran by Perfect, singing Perfect. And as I walked into the room to bear sad news, Debbie turned to me and said, "Trevor, can we dance?" So I had the sad news. She was listening to the music and invited me to dance. And so I had a choice. So I don't need to tell you, I took the option of dancing with Debbie, but it became a little parable for me of holding sadness, terrible sadness, and joy together in one moment. And music made that possible.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, just to think about, I mean, it's not usual. It's not usual for us to think about joy and sadness and that they can coexist at the same time.
Sure, yeah.
Wow. And also, I'm wondering whether there's also a recognition in that moment for you, a recognition that while I have received this news and it's heartbreaking for me at the moment as I'm feeling it, it's not yet Debbie's story. I am holding this story now. She hasn't yet received it, and it's not yet her story. So I will honor her story of wanting to dance now while I hold what I'm holding.
Sure. You've put it in a very special way. Thank you. Thank you. I wasn't aware. In some respects, you've made me more aware that in that moment I was holding a story of sadness so that I could honor another story so that we could maybe in the end bring two stories together. So thank you.
Wow. I want us to move a little bit further and talk about where you see the intersections between the work that you have done. You have written a number of books. I think I have a count of up to 22, and some of those books I have had the privilege to look at them and read them. And one that I want us to reflect a little bit on is Hope Beyond Tears. I was thinking about that book because, first of all, it's a book that I've gone back to several times in my own personal journey because I've had to live with grief for much longer than I thought I actually had grief. Initially, I didn't know I was living with grief until it happened. And so it's been a book that has been accompanying me for a while. And also, I'm thinking about that book particularly because of the times that we are in. I would dare say that the global community and maybe our community, our more immediate communities, are actually living with enormous amount of grief. As sometimes grief is very, very shy. It doesn't show itself, and yet it is quietly there. It can sit in the quiet of our hearts while we go about doing our business. To highlight that part, I want you to tell us the story of your interaction, your coming to terms with the story around Mary Magdalene and the encounter with risen Christ. And then I've got a few invitations from there.
Well, if you were to say to me, Trevor, what is your favorite story in the Bible? My favorite story in the Bible is the encounter between the risen Christ and Mary outside the tomb on Easter Sunday morning. That is, for me, if you said, Trevor, you're allowed one story, you could cut out one story of the Bible, I would take that story. And that's why I wrote that book. And if I know that each chapter is constructed around each line in that story. And each line in that story tells a story. So it is a multi-layered story, and it's just my favorite story. It just when I first read it, it blew my mind, and it's been blowing my mind ever since. And if Easter Sunday comes around, I'll be talking about the story.
Mm. Mm. In such difficult times as we are struggling with this public grief, our hearts can harden, right? And we can confabulate stories that emphasize self-protection. It is in such moments when our profound need, as Willard suggests, is to have our hearts open. This is what he writes in the introduction, or the preface to your letter. To turn loose the inner bondages by which we shut ourselves in, away from others, away from God. I want, first of all, for you to speak to this almost a propensity to harden hearts in the space of despair, and maybe suggest ways in which we can go about creating stories of meaning around such grief.
Sure. Well, that's a very big question, Nsamu, and I can again only respond to it very inadequately, I'm sure. I think, first of all, I need to say that sometimes grief brings us to the end of words. Sometimes our grief can be so senseless and so painful that words don't matter at all. We almost come to the end of words. And I'm aware of that in so many people, and I sometimes am so cautious about wanting to bring more words into the room, because words can be experienced sometimes as empty or cliched and not helpful, and particularly religious words. I think also sometimes, and we know this, and I'm sure the folk watching this and listening to this know this, I think sometimes grief does isolate us. We kind of maybe turn inwards. We feel that our sadness or our grief cannot be understood by anyone else. And so there's a sense in which I think our grief can sometimes isolate us and alienate us and cut ourselves off from others. And I think, like you've mentioned, I think sometimes in our grief we feel, I just got to get through this and I can't worry about anyone else at the moment. So I'm aware of the complexity of grief and what grief can do in our lives. And then I also want to say, having said that sometimes when our grief finds expression, when we're able to put words to our tears, sometimes in that moment, isolation can be overcome, and I feel a sense of belonging to someone, maybe to someone else or a community. You know, the Bible has a word, you know this, and we all know this. The Bible has a word, but we don't take it seriously. It's the word lament, that in grief we lament. And when, you know, I think when you read the Psalms, for examples, they are stories of lament, where people complain, where people express their anger towards enemies or towards God, or where people just can put their pain into words. And I think that if we can provide some conversational places where people can lament without being fixed up, or without being comforted too quickly, I think that is a very important thing, because it just means I feel that my grief is witnessed. Someone is witnessing my grief. And it's almost like I need a human wailing war. And I've needed a human wailing war. And I think we all at times need a human wailing war that witnesses our grief, that gives it respect, that where we can lament together, maybe even. And I sometimes get worried that within church spaces, we don't have places for lament. I think sometimes we want to move very quickly to maybe comfort, or we don't need to lament because death has been defeated. But sometimes we've got to take our time before we can get to maybe where there is hope. So and particularly at a time like this, I think we really do need conversational places where we can honor each other's griefs. You know, there is that expression in the Bible. Paul says we are called to weep with those who weep. And there is something there that's very, very important. And that's not to say that when you share your grief with me, I immediately share my grief with you. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking that maybe when you share your grief with me, it just gives me an opportunity to, in some small way, grieve with you and maybe weep with you. And I think it also gives us an opportunity, particularly as people of faith, that in the Bible, there are so many stories of grief and sadness and pain. And sometimes we can find a biblical story that somehow echoes our own story. And it's sometimes when our story and a Bible story comes together with a common theme of grief or of sadness, something very deep can happen. It's almost as if in the bringing together of our story and the Bible story, it's almost as if in that moment, God can become real in a new way for us in our own grief. And that is something that is quite moving to witness.
And because we live in a society that is driven by kind of a functionality somehow, and even the whole idea of faith has become very functional. That I can easily dismiss somebody's grief as a lack of faith and a lack of trust in something. And so, as you're speaking, what I'm thinking about is that maybe in some way, distinguishes us from really being people that love is our ability to grieve and mourn. And I'm wondering whether, you know, grief is another word for love. You know, to learn to love truly is to almost invite oneself to grieve, to grieving.
Sure.
So if I don't grieve, if I don't allow myself to mourn and grieve, chances are that I will not love fully, and whatever that love means, and it's not very sentimental in this sense. I'm just thinking of a profound expression of love in the stories of Jesus. One of which being him at the tomb with Lazarus. That Jesus wept. We're so quick now in our culture to want to get over the pain, get over grief, you know, and the industry almost dictates to us that get over the grief. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, you must be done with your grief. We just want productivity. You know, that story you mentioned, sitting in lament. I'm just thinking about that line that talks about walking in the vale of tears. How to be comfortable to sit in the vale of tears with others who weep. I want us to move a little bit here, because we'll come back to that whole thing of sitting with others who weep in a moment, and what the implications of that in our everyday living and in our listening, in the work that some people do on a regular basis. I want you to tell us the story about your encounter with Gordon Cosby.
Sure.
And what did he say to you that keeps that encounter vitalizing?
Yeah, in 1978, I worked in a small little church in Washington, and when I was leaving there to come back to South Africa, I was with Gordon Cosby. He was the pastor of the church, and he had one sentence that he gave me, which was very, very important. He said, "Don't forget, when you go back to South Africa, every person sits next to their own pool of tears. Every person sits next to their own pool of tears." And I've never forgotten that sentence. I think our life is shaped by sentences that we've heard, and in the top 3 sentences that have shaped my life, that sentence is one of them. And it's just that whenever I'm with someone, I'm aware that somewhere in this person's story, there is a pool of tears. And there's a pool of tears that I sit next to as well. And so it's just, I think, deepened my awareness that we meet each other alongside our pools of tears. I don't think that tells the whole story about us. I think we also have a pool of hope next to us as well. And that's what I meant when I was speaking earlier, that, you know, that in our pools of tears, there are little droplets of hope as well. But sometimes as we listen to a person's pool of tears, we can also pay attention just to those, to stay with the metaphor of a pool, we can just listen to also those little droplets of hope and love and faith that I'm not bringing to the story, but are already present in that story. And so I'm learning that when we pay attention to each other's pool of tears, we also over time get drawn to the hope in people's lives, the resilience in people's lives, the courage in people's lives, the trust in people's lives, the faith in their lives. And I'm constantly moved by this. You know, when I'm with someone, you know, and their story then strengthens me and strengthens my courage and my faith and my trust and my hope. So it's a story, it's a line that has always been with me, but I've also discovered that it's a line that if I really listen to someone's pool of tears, it isn't long before I also listen to those little droplets of courage and resilience and hope that characterize, I want to suggest, every human being. And we just need to make sure that they don't get lost in the pool of tears. There's also, we need to look for those other little droplets as well.
I'm thinking about the story that you told of you and Baby in her study, and you being the bearer of sad news. And you mentioned then that while you were bearing the sad news, she was inviting you to a dance. And in that moment, while you were bearing sad news, she was inviting you to a dance. And that coexistence of, while I might be sitting with somebody and they're sitting next to their pool of tears, those tears, though painful, can actually contain at the same time the joy of knowing that I am breathing now because I love.
Sure, absolutely. And it's so important, I think, and I'm not going to, I don't want to go too far down this route, but in that story between Jesus and Mary, when Jesus met Mary, Mary was sitting next to her pool of tears. And Jesus did not try to cheer her up. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't say to her, for goodness sake, Mary, can't you see it's Easter Sunday. He doesn't do that. He asks her a question. Mary, why are you crying? Why are you crying? And she tells that story of her tears, and then the story of her tears slowly moves into a story of resurrection hope. But it had to start with telling the story of tears. And then as the story gets told, resurrection hope begins to come into the story.
And that is how we storify pain as a way of processing the pain, right? We storify it, and then it transcends itself more than just what the immediate experience might be.
Sure. Yeah. I think you've said it. Yeah.
In chapter 3, you invite us to this experience, and I want us to spend a bit of time on this one, weeping with those who weep, because for me there's a significance here. I like to think about therapy as a way of weeping with those who weep, whether it's in the context of pastoral therapy, whether it's in the context of other forms of therapies in other contexts. So the therapeutic relationship in such a context can be that of witnessing another, and probably a form of shared grief and sorrow. This is what you write. Community develops not only as we share our joys, but also as we share our pain. And I think you've spoken to this a little bit already. So I want you to probably speak a little more about the place of community, and the place of community in holding each other's grief and in witnessing to grief. particularly in these times that we're all living in this space of grief.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Again, just to say very simply, I think we have, and my sense is that everyone who's watching this, are significantly involved with people in different communal contexts. And I think we really do have a responsibility, a very deep responsibility, of creating safe places where our stories of loss and sadness and grief, particularly through the pandemic, can simply be told and can be witnessed. And I think it's so important that when I witness another person's story of pain, it is so important for me to somehow, on one level, allow myself to be deeply impacted by their story. I don't put up a professional mask between myself and them. I'm not an impersonal being. I'm a person in relationship with them, and their story is affecting my story. However, I think it is also important for me not to let my tears suddenly, overwhelm them. That's not the place. I need to somehow hold my own pain and hold my own tears, even as I hear their pain and their sadness. And that can be a difficult journey, but it's, I think, a very, very important one. And it just creates and keeps a place safe for the sharing of grief. I think I also need to say that I think we're living in a context where it's the traumatized listening to the traumatized. So that if I am listening to stories of pain and loss, I also need to ensure that I have people in my life, friends. I need a little community or a community in my life where I can also process my own sadness and my own tears. So I need to be careful that when I listen to someone else, I don't overwhelm them with my sadness or my pain. By it. And I also need to ensure that as I'm listening to their story of pain, that there will be a space and a time for me as well, as a fellow human being, to be able to tell my story or to share my story of sadness and loss as well.
I mean, sharing, as you indicated a little earlier, sharing in somebody else's pain is not necessarily overriding theirs, almost overriding theirs, or suggesting to them, "Oh, you haven't seen the worst of it. Let me tell you mine." Or,
sure.
Well, I understand. I know what you're going through. I actually don't know.
Sure.
And sometimes weeping with those who weep, just being present. I like what you said, that sometimes grief brings us to the end of our words, and probably the end of our imagination, and end of our imagination, the end of story. In terms of words, but there's a story that still lives in that space. And this makes me wonder about how you think about the therapeutic space as a community of companionship.
There are in that one sentence that you've used, there are some very big words. Therapeutic is a big word, space is a big word, and companionship is a big word. So I just I know that I'm not going to do justice to your question because each of those words have meanings attached to them. But I'm going to just focus a little bit on the word companionship. you know, in a world that is becoming increasingly professionalized, I sometimes need amateurs to be with me, if that makes sense. That sometimes there can be such a professionalization that I need someone who is a companion, an amateur companion, who is companion me out of a real love for me and care for me as a human being, and not only because maybe they are being paid. Now, in no way am I'm not undermining the place of paid therapy or going for counseling where I pay. I'm not undermining that at all. That is critical. But sometimes my deepest need is for a companion who is walking with me on this road. And there's something that is non-professional about companionship. And there's something beautiful, you know, we talk about an amateur. The meaning of amateur is I'm in this for the love of it. And sometimes I want someone who is with me because of the love of companionship. And you can pick that up almost immediately. If there are professionals listening in now on this conversation, I would want to say that if my professional space has room for human companionship within that space, I think that professional space can be made more humane by the element of real companionship. So I would want to say that in a professional space where I get alongside someone as a companion, as a non-expert, and I come into this space really wanting to learn what it's like to walk in your shoes, then that professional space, I think, can be a profoundly healing space for that human being. And I think we pick that up immediately. You know, is this person only listening to me because I'm paying them to listen to me? Or is this person listening to me? Yes, I am paying them to listen to me, but I can pick up a real intention to be a companion, to walk alongside of me on this road. I think the person sharing can pick that up immediately. And if that is present, I think it is particularly life-giving and healing for the person who is sharing their story with us.
And I can recognize that in some of my own encounters, and when I sit with somebody and I walk away feeling like this guy, this person, this human being sees the human in me. They see me. This person sees me. And again, without sentimentalizing the word love, it's really coming to that place where I'm in the presence of somebody that loves me.
Sure.
Now, we're coming close to the end now. I'm just wondering whether there's something that you would like to say. I'm going to have a little bit of a rapid fire round. And I'm just wondering for now whether there's something that is still hanging there that you want to highlight that maybe we haven't discussed.
I'm very happy to move to the rapid fire.
Good. Yeah, so something that Trevor and myself share is running, and maybe we share many things, but running is one of those things we both like to get up in the morning and run. And so here are a few rapid fire questions, very quickly. So you choose any one of the following, Trevor. Sweet or sour?
Sweet.
Oh, okay. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Wow. Treadmill or road?
Road.
Road. All right. Mountains or sea?
Sea.
Oh. Company or solo?
Company with certain people.
Right. I hear that. I hear that. Yeah. And that's so I'd like to thank you, Trevor, for giving us this time to have this conversation. I'm deeply enriched by just having this conversation with you. And I'm sitting with a lot of gratitude in my heart and a great sense of, I used the word trepidation earlier, like really sitting there because I know that this conversation has changed me. It has changed me in the way that I think about sitting with other people in the work that I do. And also in the daily choices that I make as I work with others. So I'm deeply grateful for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for today, and we are going to continue inviting you to these monthly conversations of meaning. So if you don't know how to sign up for the conversations of meaning that will be running for the rest of the year, you can visit us to www.i4cc.co.za, and all the details are there. So next month you can join us when we talk with Nikki Dixon about her narrative therapy journey and specific narrative ideas and techniques. So thank you very much.